When Hugo Chavez died in March 2013, Venezuela was left in a fragile state. The charismatic leader who had transformed the nation through the Bolivarian Revolution had concentrated power, redistributed oil wealth, and reshaped the political landscape. In that moment of loss and uncertainty, Nicolás Maduro Moros stepped forward. Maduro had served as vice president under Chavez and was a loyal disciple of his ideology. Chavez had signaled Maduro as his preferred successor before his final illness, though Maduro himself lacked the magnetic authority of his predecessor. In a special election held on April 14, 2013, Maduro narrowly defeated opposition candidate Enrique Capriles by a margin of roughly 1.5% of the vote, a result that sparked immediate controversy and claims of irregularities. Despite these disputes, Venezuela's National Election Council upheld the outcome, and on April 19th, Maduro was sworn in as president, embarking on a precarious journey to consolidate power in a nation already strained by economic decline, deep political division, and social unrest. Maduro inherited an economy that was unraveling. The oil-dependent state that had once enjoyed vast revenues was now struggling with falling production, rising inflation, and chronic shortages of food and medicine. Maduro continued many of Chavez's policies, maintaining expansive social programs funded by the state and attempting to harness petrodollars to sustain support among the poor and working classes. Yet, oil production continued its descent, and revenue shortfalls deepened public dissatisfaction. In response to mounting economic pressure, Maduro's government began to rely more heavily on executive decrees, emergency powers, and expanded control over state institutions. Bridges between branches of government narrowed rapidly as the presidency asserted authority over the legislature and judiciary, fostering a concentration of power that critics warned was eroding democratic norms. Trust in political institutions declined as citizens faced daily hardship, even as state propaganda framed these struggles as external attacks, often attributing Venezuela's woes to foreign interference rather than internal governance challenges. The early years of Maduro's rule were marked by persistent opposition protests and violent crackdowns. Demonstrations surged in response to food and medicine shortages, hyperinflation, and allegations of electoral fraud. The government deployed security forces to suppress dissent, and reports emerged of arbitrary detentions and limitations on press freedoms. Institutions nominally intended to check executive power were gradually reshaped to support the presidency, including courts and electoral bodies filled with loyalists. Maduro's political base, though eroded in popularity, remained anchored by alliances with the military, state bureaucracies, and segments of the population who still associated the government with social welfare distribution. These complex internal dynamics, economic hardship, political polarization, and institutional reshuffling, laid the groundwork for a consolidation of power that critics characterized as increasingly authoritarian. As the decade progressed, Venezuela's economic collapse deepened. What had once been a nation overflowing with oil wealth devolved into one of the worst economic crises in modern Latin American history. Between 2013 and 2025, the Venezuelan gross domestic product shrank dramatically, with estimates showing contractions of over 70%, hyperinflation reaching unprecedented levels, and unemployment rising sharply. The currency, the bolívar, became nearly worthless, and everyday goods, even basic necessities, vanished from shelves. Millions fled the country seeking stability abroad, creating a migration crisis that reverberated across the region. Maduro's government struggled to provide solutions, often framing external factors, such as economic sanctions and capitalist speculation, as chief culprits. This narrative, whether accepted or rejected by the public, underscored a government under siege, responding with defensive rhetoric and defensive policy measures rather than broad structural reform. From that point forward, the narrative should slow down and narrow its focus, shifting from outcomes to atmosphere, from events to structures of power that were quietly hardening. What followed was not a sudden rupture, but a gradual closing of space. Institutions that once claimed autonomy began to align more closely with the executive. The judiciary, the electoral authority, and key regulatory bodies increasingly reflected the priorities of the presidency, reducing the room for internal checks and debate. Political opponents still existed, elections were still held, and public discourse had not yet vanished, but the balance between branches of government was no longer what it had been only a few years earlier. At the same time, the state expanded its role in the economy. Strategic sectors, particularly oil, electricity, and food distribution, were brought more firmly under central control. The official justification was sovereignty and social justice, a continuation of the Bolivarian project. Yet in practice, this concentration of authority meant that economic decision-making became highly dependent on political loyalty, and institutional expertise was often replaced by ideological alignment. Within the armed forces, loyalty to the government was cultivated not only through rhetoric, but through direct integration into civilian administration. Military officers began to occupy positions in ministries, state companies, and regional governments. The line between political leadership and military command grew increasingly thin, creating a system in which the survival of the government and the cohesion of the security forces became deeply intertwined. For ordinary Venezuelans, daily life still carried echoes of normality. Shops remained open, schools functioned, cities moved. Yet beneath the surface, confidence was eroding. Inflation, though not yet catastrophic, was persistent. Basic goods became intermittently scarce. The national currency weakened, and capital quietly flowed out of the country. Many sensed that the economic model was under strain, but few could yet imagine how far the decline would go. Internationally, Venezuela's posture also shifted. Relations with the United States and several European governments grew tense, while political and economic ties with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba deepened. The government framed this realignment as the construction of a multipolar world, an escape from Western dominance. Critics, however, saw it as increasing isolation from traditional financial systems and democratic norms. By the end of this period, Nicolás Maduro had not yet become the symbol of collapse he would later be known as. But the foundations of a highly centralized state were firmly in place. Power was increasingly personal, institutions increasingly dependent, and dissent increasingly constrained. The system that had been built under Chávez and inherited by his chosen successor was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a structure. And once such a structure is completed, history shows it rarely changes gently.